All right, welcome everybody. I'm going to hand it over to Tristan Wallhead to start our March Coffee with Colleagues from AIESEP.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. I'm located in the US, in the University of Wyoming, in the Mountain West region of the US. And so it is 9 o'clock in the morning here. I know in Europe it's probably a little later. Thank you for joining this morning for our AIESEP Connect event that I'm hosting and presenting. The topic of today's Connect event is really looking at, I've captured it with the phrase, taking it out of PE. And really what we're looking at here is a discussion of evidence for the transfer of physical activity behaviors within physical education to extracurricular contexts. Just to preface the session, the development or the role of physical education in the development of a physical activity lifestyle has become a ubiquitous goal across the globe. And so it's been a hook of potentially why physical education is important and giving students the skills and knowledge that they enact as they move out of physical education within extracurricular contexts and then from a lifetime standpoint. And there's been a large scale physical literacy movement which has really captured the essence of this phenomenon. The challenge I think we face in our field, or one of the challenges, is providing evidence that what students experience in physical education motivates them or makes them formulate behaviors outside of physical education. And what empirical evidence do we have for that connection? And Peter's going to talk about generalization. I'm going to use the word transfer. Before I start on my part of today's sort of Connect session, I would like just to briefly introduce Peter. Peter Isabitz at the University of Leuven, and we've collaborated previously through the AIESEP network, actually. And he's going to talk about this phenomenon of transfer or generalizability using a sort of behavioral lens. And his graduate student, Kian, I don't know if he's logged on separately or whether he's going to be on Peter's screen. Kian's done several studies looking at this idea of generalizability of behaviors from PE to specifically lunch recess contexts. I'm going to provide some data on a recent study that looked at this idea of transfer. Now, I use a more socio-cognitive framework to look at this idea of what students take them from their motivation for a particular activity in PE, and then how do they transfer that motivation to extracurricular contexts, and whether they actually participate in those same activities and why. So I'd like to make a start on a recent study. I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to talk to the group really about a particular lifetime sport that I've been interested in terms of transfer. So to give you a little, the sort of title of this particular presentation and this data set is really the transfer of middle school student motivation for mountain biking in physical education and to participation in extracurricular biking opportunities. And this is a group, a couple of my colleagues here are in the psychology department and really are interested in the effects of biking probably on psychological constructs and executive functioning. But my interest is really, if we teach students to ride bikes in PE, do they choose to ride bikes outside of PE? And that's the essence of this study. I think it's important to give a context. When we look at the transfer of physical activity behaviors from PE to extracurricular context, you need to understand the context. Now, I live in Wyoming in USA, and if any of you were around here in 2016 AIESEP, we actually hosted it in Laramie, Wyoming. So to give you an idea, Wyoming's a very sort of natural resource areas full of mountains and large spaces. And it does have particular emphasis on outdoor activities. And so mountain biking is very popular in this region of the US. So I think that's really important to understand. In the town I live in, which is Laramie, there is a trail system that's very close to the school that we worked in. And so understanding the physical context is also important in understanding the transfer of these particular behaviors. So this project was funded by Specialized Foundation. If any of you are into mountain biking, Specialized is a very large corporate US group that makes mountain bikes. And the head of Specialized has ADHD. And so he discovered mountain biking when he was in middle school. And so he's been sponsoring the giving bikes to middle school groups over the last 10 years. And they've developed a curriculum called Riding for Focus, which is a PE-based curriculum, which looks at some basic skills of teachers, students, basic skills of biking, but also then develops their self-challenge in the different types of trail rides as they go through the unit of instruction. So there's some preliminary evidence that teachers who use this curriculum, students expressed interest in biking outside of PE. And also that they would increase their motivation for biking during PE. My previous work that I've done using this framework has looked at really more sport-based activities. If we teach using, for example, a sport-based model called sport education, and I've done several studies looking at if we teach with that model, do the students choose to participate in those sport activities if we offer them at recess? And so what I took was from that framework and then applied it to mountain biking in the last 2 years. This is it's a multi-theory model. It's called the trans-contextual model of motivation. And really what we're looking at here from a motivational standpoint is the whole idea of developing students what we call autonomous motivation, or their self-determined motivation within a physical education context. We do that through curricular interventions that really focus on what we call autonomy support. In other words, giving students choice within the curriculum, but also developing their competence and their relatedness to others. In other words, satisfying their basic psychological needs for motivation within the PE curriculum. Now, this can hypothetically be applied to any content area. Specifically, this was with mountain biking. And one of the key ideas Hager put together with this theoretical framework is that if we develop autonomous forms of motivation in PE, these will transfer to similar behaviors within extracurricular contexts. That is also true for, if you're looking at the framework there for controlled forms of motivation in PE, they also transfer to controlled forms of motivation for those activities in leisure time contexts. Now, in terms of the prediction of extracurricular biking participation, your motivation for an activity or particular movement form is somewhat distal to whether you enact that behavior. But we still need to develop those autonomous forms of motivation for that particular behavior. But whether you enact that behavior within a leisure time or extracurricular context is filtered through what we call more behavioral regulators. Now, for those of you who are familiar with some psychological theories, this is a theory called the theory of planned behavior, where intention is probably the strongest predictor of your actual behavior within a leisure time context. And your intention to enact a particular behavior, in this case, mountain biking, is filtered through your attitude towards that behavior, whether it's positive or negative, the subjective norm expectation of others. In other words, people who are important or significant to you, whether they want you to do that behavior within that extracurricular context. And then also, do you have what we call perceived behavioral control? You only will enact that behavior if you feel that you have the resources to do the behavior. In this case, mountain biking, do I have a bike? Can I access a particular trail system? Or it could be resources in terms of, do I have the necessary competence and confidence to be able to ride the bike within that leisure time context? So this sort of theory really works through the stages of how we transfer from PE to extracurricular context. So the idea of this study is to use that as that the TCM as a theoretical lens to examine middle school students' transfer from PE to extracurricular biking. And specifically, what we did in this study is we taught the mountain biking curriculum in PE, and then we offered an after-school biking club twice a week. It was volitional. In other words, the students did not have to attend the after-school biking club, but if they so choose, they could. So we had 200 middle school students who went through this curriculum, and the biking curriculum, the unit lasts about 3 weeks. In Wyoming, we have good weather probably through October. That our winters are quite harsh, and so we don't use the bikes too much in the winter. So we had a fall biking season, and then we have one in the spring. And what we did, we surveyed the students during the biking unit to get a sense of those variables that are embedded in the contextual model of motivation. So this is going to light you up first thing in the morning with all these particular beta coefficients. What I want to orient you to was we ran a structural model test. And for those that are into model testing, the model fit indices are at the bottom there. But what are important is if you look at the yellow boxes, if you just want to look at colors on the boxes, that might orient you to key relationships that we found when we looked at mountain biking in PE and then to the after school club. What we did see, if you're starting on the left side of this diagram, is that the Riding for Focus curriculum did provide autonomy support, which positively impacted their autonomous motivation for biking in PE. That was the first, that beta coefficients that are in blue are the significant ones. And then that motivation for biking in PE did transfer to their motivation to bike in extracurricular contexts. Then what we see is some very strong beta coefficients which really move through from autonomous motivation in the leisure time or extracurricular context, and they do predict each of the 3 planned behavior variables: attitude, subjective norm, and perceived behavioral control. So all of those were strong relationships, particularly the relationship between motivation for biking in leisure time context and what we call subjective norm expectations. Now, this was interesting. This group are about 12 to 13 years old. And any of you who have taught middle schoolers realize that their peer groups are very important references for whether they do particular behaviors. And so subjective norm was a very strong mediator of their intention to bike within the after-school context. And then the intention, and it was a very strong, if you look at the R-squared value above intention, that's pretty high in terms of explaining intention to bike. So we had a pretty robust model fit here that reinforced many of the key ideas within the TCM. And we did get a strong predictive relationship to actual biking behavior in the extracurricular context. So key takeaways. The curriculum developed by Specialized does promote autonomy support and fosters autonomous motivation within the PE setting. This schema of autonomous motivation does transfer to other similar biking contexts within the middle school. So students were more motivated to bike within after-school contexts. The autonomous motivation predicted intention for biking, and intention for biking was a very strong predictor of actual behavior, biking behavior within the after-school context. So for those of you who are interested, so what does this mean in terms of practical implications? If you are looking to transfer what you are teaching in PE to after school or extracurricular context, what's important is the way that you have to develop a curriculum that develops competence, relatedness, and autonomy. And so for these students, they needed the skills of biking first through more direct forms of instruction. But then as the unit progressed, they would choose their own challenge trails, they would design their own obstacle courses, and so there's a level of autonomy embedded in the curriculum. That seemed to foster more autonomous forms of motivation. if you are looking to transfer a particular movement form, you need to provide a closely related behavioral environment to that PE environment. In this case, the students could come to the after school club, use the bikes that were available, and they didn't need their parents to transport them or their bikes to trails that were far away from the school. And so provision of a closely related physical activity behavior environment does promote that transfer. And lastly, what we learned through this project over the last 2 or 3 years is that peers are a powerful socializing agent to promote extracurricular participation. Particularly for girls, we had very few girls attending the after school club. What we did then, we offered a girls' night, and so from the after school club context. And what we saw then was that these peer groups really socialized those students into attending the after school club. They may have developed the competence within the physical education environment, but unless you develop a positive socializing environment within the after school club, then the students won't participate. And so there's some very sort of key takeaways, what we've learned from this project in developing this idea of transfer. Okay. I want to transfer, that was just a brief study, resume of a study that I did. I don't want to take all the time today because I also want to really give some time, one for Peter and Kian to present their work, but then also that we can have some time for discussion about this idea of transfer and generalizability. So I'm going to, if you don't mind, I'm going to hold questions till after Peter and Kian have presented, and then I'd like, if you've got questions and to discuss, we'll hold them till then. Peter, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. Am I audible? Okay, excellent. Thank you. Kian and I are very happy to be part of this coffee talk. Thank you, AIESEP, for organizing this, although it is almost cocktail hour here in Leuven. So, but never mind. Thank you, Tristan, for strengthening the Leuven, Wyoming connection here in this research. So as Tristan introduced, we're going to take a behavioral lens and a couple of studies we did in connecting physical education content with recess. So our university is quite in the middle of Europe, quite close to Brussels. Here you see some nice pictures of our university. Not going to hold a promotional campaign here since we don't have time. But I want to discuss the following things with you all. So we're going to talk about how we see generalization or transfer, as you might call it as well. We're going to talk about some main findings from the research that we have been doing since 2016, I think. And we're going to discuss the implication and opportunities for physical education teachers and PED faculty as well in establishing that connection between physical education and more outside of physical education context. So the central argument we want to put forward is that if you want physical education to contribute to the development of a physically active lifestyle, you need a deliberate strategy because it does not happen automatically. You need some strategies in doing that. And as you all know, in many countries of the world, the development of a physically active lifestyle is in the standards of physical education. And as Tristan introduced, there's actually not that much evidence for it. What we want to argue is that by making a connection between the content in physical education and what children can engage in during recess, it might help them to practice what they learned and to increase at the same time their moderate to vigorous physical activity. So, as I just mentioned, there's actually little evidence of physical education effect, meaning that what happens in physical education has an effect on what children do outside of physical education or later on in life. So although that might seem as a depressing thought, we also know some reasons why it is difficult, because it comes with a lot of methodological challenges when you need to measure children out in outside of school context, when you have to, as we all know, some research that investigates the lifestyle of adults, and they try to connect that with their experiences in physical education. So it's quite complicated, and we started to think, how can we actually set up work that shows that physical education contributes to the development of a physically active lifestyle. We were inspired by the work of Tom McKenzie, of Jim Salis, like the M-SPAN studies, the SPARK studies, the work by Tristan as well, as he mentioned. So we thought, well, what if we would take a setting where we can measure children's behavior, which is still outside of physical education, but still on school. That would help us to overcome some methodological challenges because they would still be on site, and it might also increase our experimental control. And how about we make a connection between physical education and that setting we were interested in, which is recess, because it is less structured, it's occurring or it's scheduled in many countries each day, so it's quite easy to do so. We focus on the development of motor skills for all children, because if you want children to engage in an activity outside of physical education, they need to have the skills to do so, because if they lack the skills, participation might be hindered. And what if we do a systematic observation to clearly observe and analyze what children do in both settings and see whether there is some generalization of behaviors from physical education to recess? So we started in 2013, and it was with Rosalie Kolkens, a doctoral student at that time. She graduated in 2018. And we set up a study where we taught children to a parkour unit, as you can see on the left-hand side. That's a physical education lesson in elementary. And we taught the children parkour, and at the same time, we offered them the opportunity once a week to voluntarily participate in a parkour session during lunch recess. So voluntary, and you can see on the right-hand side, the same setup. Children are not dressed for physical education, but they just could come in to the gym and they could engage in parkour activities. So we started with parkour, and we wanted to make that connection with recess, because in Flanders, recess is at least 50 minutes during lunch, which means that children are at least 50 minutes free. And during that time, they need to have lunch, and they can then, for the rest of the time, they spend their time on the playground. Or if they chose to, they went to parkour recess. So conceptually, we considered physical education here on the left side of the continuum, which is a structured setting. It is mandatory. And on the other side of the continuum, on the right-hand side, we have the out-of-school context, which is not structured and which is obviously voluntary. And we considered that based on previous results, also with the methodological challenges, that the step from physical education and to have an effect for physical education, to have an effect on what happens in that out-of-school context, which is way far from physical education, that might be too complicated. So we decided here to really start with organized recess, where children are still at the school, in a structured environment, less structured than in physical education, and it is voluntary. We thought that we might have more success in building a connection with that setting instead of aiming for the end game, the holy grail outside of school physical activity, actually. And we also measured what children did during traditional recess, which is the time the children spent every day on the playground after they had lunch, which is the regular setting. So conceptually, generalization, we define it as the application of skills during recess that were learned in physical education. And as I just mentioned, generalization does not occur automatically, so we needed to help the children a little bit in generalizing that behavior. So we used the same content. It was parkour during physical education, and it was parkour during parkour recess. We set up the same environment, which was similar to what happened in physical education. So it was the same setup of equipment. It was also the same physical education teacher who spent 20 minutes of his free time during parkour recess. The teacher prompted a little bit during recess, so children came in and they were allowed to play, and the teacher did just some easy prompting like, hey kids, show me what you learned in previous physical education lesson, now you can go out and play. And obviously in physical education, we made sure that the content was developmentally appropriate for children of different ability levels so that they would have some basic and required skills to participate in physical education. Conceptually, the work is also aligned with CSPAP, where, as you know, it's a multi-component approach that targets several settings during the school day for children to achieve the 60 minutes of MVPA per day guideline. And especially the coordination of different components in CSPAP is important to maximize the application of knowledge and skills learned in physical education. So conceptually here we connected physical education and the physical activity during school component, which is recess. So the design of the studies was actually always quite similar. There was a standardized workshop for the teachers. The teachers then taught a certain unit in physical education. While the unit was taught in physical education, the children had the opportunity once a week to voluntarily participate in an organized recess where they just could go to the gym and engage in the activity learned during physical education. We used sport education in practically all studies we did, and we used systematic observation. So as you can see here, the design was always quite similar. Usually we had a 10-lesson sport education season in physical education. And then we had about 10 organized recess sessions, which we considered the generalization setting. And we also, just to have a comparison group, we also measured the children's behavior when they spend their time on the playground, as they did on any other day during the week, to have an idea of the effect of organized recess on their MVPA. So we measured them. In the beginning, we did parkour, but it was a 3-year-long study which Kian van Leuven and Shu Cheng, 2 grad students, completed, which is now done. And we also had team handball and smashball with the same children. And we have those 3 settings where we observe the children's behavior. We used systematic observation. We measured the physical activity levels of all children in all settings. So that was quite intensive. We worked with quite many coders and had to train them. In the beginning, we did it all on paper, but luckily we found some funding and we developed an application on iPad with which we could do the systematic observation coding in both physical education, like we used SOFIT, and during traditional recess on the playground, we used SOCART. It was Kian who led this project and who saved us quite some workload in dealing with that work. I'm going to pass it on now to Kian. We're going to do a switch of chairs and talk about some main findings of the results.
Thank you. All right, I'm going to continue with the outcomes or the main dependent variables we looked into with our studies, which are participation, which was voluntary, and MVPA during these settings. We have a growing evidence base since 2018, in which I will guide you to the results in the next coming slides. So first of all, the study of Cheng, where we, of course, did a parkour study, and you see that there are very high participation rates for both boys and girls. In session 2 and 4, there is a significant difference between boys and girls, in which girls participated more. However, both overall, there were no difference found for boys versus girls for voluntary participation. When we look into a study in first grade of secondary school, which was a fitness lesson unit during physical education and fitness recess, we also had a difference between girls and boys in favor of girls in recess session 2 and 6. And overall, we had high voluntary participation rates at the beginning, which tended to decrease towards the end. Then in another study of Xu Cheng, there was room for an extra phase. So we have a generalization phase in which the physical education curriculum was taught concurrently with the organization of 5 parcours recess sessions. And then afterwards, in the maintenance phase, the physical education teacher continued to teach physical education curriculum, but anything except parcours. But we still offer children the opportunity to participate in 5 recess sessions. So there was a disconnection there between physical education content and the organized recess session. What do we see here? Again, we see a difference in just one recess session between boys and girls in favor of the girls. But we also see that participation rates are higher during the generalization phase, during the phase in which physical education is connected with the parcours recess compared to the maintenance phase. This was also a study done in elementary school. Following study also in elementary school, and this is the start of our 3-year longitudinal study. So we started in 2nd grade of elementary schools. Again, we have a difference between boys and girls in favor of the girls. Again, we have a higher participation rate during the generalization or intervention phase compared to the maintenance phase. However, we see a decline in the maintenance phase. Still, half of the children were voluntarily participating during those recess sessions, which is quite important. We go to the team handball recess year. So children are in the 3rd year of elementary schools here. Again, we have a difference between boys and girls only in recess 4. And here we only have a difference in participation rate between the 2 phases, intervention phase and maintenance phase, for the girls. The participation rates in the 2 phases for boys were similar. Participation rates were a bit lower than compared to parcours or the 1st year of the longitudinal study, but still around 50%, half of the children voluntarily participated during team handball recess. Overall, no differences between boys and girls. And then we go into the 3rd year of our longitudinal study, where we introduced a smash ball lesson unit, which is a net game which focuses on spiking in elementary schools. Again, we have a significant difference in recess session 2, with girls participating more than boys, but overall no differences were found between boys and girls. And here again, same as in the handball recess study, we have higher participation rates during the intervention phase compared to the maintenance phase for girls. And overall, participation rates are a bit lower here in the smash ball recess. Here's a short overview of all the studies that are related to generalization and maintenance line of research. And interesting to see is that we have a bit of lower rates in the 1st grade of secondary school, and that we have different participation rates which are lower in team handball and smash ball when you compare them to the parcours content. It might be due to the parcours content. It might also be due to the age of the children. Children are getting older, and we know that with increasing age, children tend to be less physically active, which might also translate into their voluntary participation behaviors during organized recess. And let's look into physical activity during those organized recess sessions. So I'll start again back with the study of Cheng, which was an elementary parcours study. So during organized recess, during parcours recess, the MVPA levels of both boys and girls were higher than their MVPA levels during physical education, and more interesting, also higher than their physical activity levels during traditional recess on the playground. And in a study of Cheng, we saw that boys were engaging in higher levels of physical activity compared to girls. In the study of Peter Iserbit in first grade of secondary schools, we also see that during fitness recess, MVPA levels were higher compared to MVPA levels on the playground during traditional recess. And similar MVPA levels were found for lower, average, and higher skilled children, and also similar levels of physical activity were found between boys and girls. When we look into the first year of the longitudinal study, again, we see that during parcours recess, MVPA levels were higher compared to traditional recess and physical education. Again, boys were achieving higher MVPA levels. They were slightly higher overall, 46% versus 58%, but were slightly higher for boys compared to girls. When we look into the team handball recess, we see the same trends. Team handball recess offered children the opportunity to engage in more MVPA compared to physical education and traditional recess. And again, boys were achieving higher MVPA levels. Here's a short overview for the MVPA during the organized recess sessions. And again, we see the highest levels of MVPA in lower elementary and in the parcours studies. Important to note, there are a couple of studies that highlight the difference between boys and girls. However, girls were still achieving more than 50% MVPA during those recess sessions. So although they were slightly less active than boys, they were still achieving levels that were higher than the guidelines for recess by Stratton and Mullen. So the main conclusions, so a majority of children participate in organized recess connected with physical education. Very important, when they are participating, they engage in higher levels of MVPA when you compare it to their time on traditional recess or on the playground. Recess can be a very important setting of public health interventions. It's scheduled every day. There is no additional curricular time needed, and it can contribute up to 20% of the daily MVPA guidelines, which is 60 minutes of MVPA a day. And very important, during those organized recess sessions, children apply skills that were learned during physical education, which can demonstrate the contribution of physical education. And to my last slide, the implications for teachers is that we need to offer children the opportunity to practice what they learned in voluntary organized recess sessions. Children need to be skillful, otherwise it will be hard for them to participate. To foster generalization or transfer, we need to recreate the same context during recess as in physical education. So the presence of the physical education teacher, the equipment, the content. Teachers can prompt children to be physically active during those organized recess sessions. So we don't need to teach anything new, but we can prompt children, and we can definitely monitor who is participating in terms of sex and skill level. All right, thank you. And of course, we couldn't have done this without a strong team. So we would like to thank all our colleagues in this work. All right.
Maybe if we could stop sharing the screen, Kian, and then we can go to the chat. I think that might be good. Thank you for the presentation, Peter and Kian. So I'm going to go to the questions, and then maybe Peter or myself, if they're directed to a particular, whether it's my study or the group of studies that Peter and Kian presented on, we'll go to those first, and then I have some more discursive questions for the group as a whole if you want to engage. So let me go to the first question here. Oh, beautiful place, Laramie. Peter has been. So yeah, how is that relevant to the mountain biking study? We didn't ask the students, the middle school students, to bike up the mountains. That's very physically demanding. We did allow them. What was interesting was the after-school club, when we talk about similarity between contexts of PE and after-school, much of the PE biking was actually on campus. We have built a single track trail on the school campus. So the students were able to use trails on campus most of the time. Towards the end of the unit of instruction on mountain biking, we were enabled to go off campus, but they weren't extensive trails within the PE time. After school was quite different in the fact that the students were able to use the bikes and bike to off-campus trails. And then they got to choose with the leaders which trail that they wanted to complete in the after-school biking club. So similar, like Kian said, similar contexts, but and organized and supervised, also quite different. The after-school club had a little bit more autonomy in terms of, and there wasn't discrete skill teaching going on in the after-school club, similar to what Kian just talked about. Did you have any women as coaches? Yes, we did. For the first 2 years, both the coaches were women. And so in the last couple of years, it's been a one male and one female coach. And so the PE teacher was female too, and it was not the same person. So that was a little different to Peter and Kian's study in the fact that the PE teacher was not leading the after-school club. It was two other teachers from the school who were just interested in mountain biking and having the students participate in mountain biking. And so we leveraged some of the resources within the school. We didn't necessarily factor that into the analysis, whether it made a difference in terms of the sex or gender of the coaches. But definitely we saw a change in the number of female students who participated in the after-school club once we provided an opportunity for an all-girls after-school club evening. And then we moved back and forth between having a single-sex after-school club, and then this last year it was co-educational, males and females, and our numbers have still grown. And it was interesting that many of the students, Peter and Kian, do a great job of actually measuring maintenance. We haven't done that as systematically, but what we're doing is tracking who is attending the after-school club as we've gone through the years. And so what we're seeing is these students, once they start attending regularly, they attend from season to season. But again, not as systematically evaluated as well as what Peter and Kian have done at maintenance. Okay, I'm going to pass the next questions over because I think they're more related to Peter and Kian's study. Over to you, Peter.
Thank you, Tristan. So what were the other students doing when the rest was doing parkour or team handball? Yeah, well, the students were after they had lunch, they could choose either they just spent their time on the playground as they did like any other day during the week, or they went to parkour or team handball or the smash ball recess, which was in the gymnasium for 20 minutes. So when it was over after the 20 minutes, they then just went back to the playground. So actually, students could choose whether they stayed on the playground or went to do parkour. So what we did is, since we used systematic observation of their behavior during the traditional, during the regular recess, and that is data we have from Xu Cheng. It's not yet published, but we found that there were some things that were interesting that had an influence on the probability of children to participate during recess. So, for example, some children who spent most of their time during regular recess in larger groups playing sports, which they organize on the playground, were less likely to participate. So we try to make a connection with some variables as in the SOCAR tool, like the activity type and the group size the children spent their time in, and the probability that they participated in organized recess. So yeah, that was something we came across. What about the photos including masks? Yes, we were challenged with COVID, and it was quite hard to navigate that COVID year. Well, it was actually 1.5 years. Our studies took longer than expected since there were some periods of where we had to live in isolation, but
Quarantines.
and quarantines and so on. Yes, but luckily we had a good relationship with schools and they trusted us, and with all the necessary measurements and precautions we could continue. So but yes, so actually our longitudinal study took longer. The data collection took just longer. So the impact on participation, it's hard to say, because in elementary schools it were actually only the higher grades and teachers who had to wear masks. So children at the lower grades where we did the study, and they didn't have to wear masks. So their participation or their physical activity was not impacted by mask wearing. So which was good. Menno's question, as recess participation was voluntary, do you have insight in which children you reached that did not reach? For example, less skilled children who might need the MVPA more might not participate, and already quite active children who are proficient are always participate. An insight into the characteristic of children that drop out of the recess program. Yes, as I mentioned about the SOCARP data we had during that traditional recess, we were able to pinpoint a couple of things. We also measured the ability levels and the effect on participation. You want to elaborate on that, Kian?
Yeah, so we tried. It's not all published at this point, of course, but we tested for each year in the study. We tested if there were differences between boys and girls, and if there were differences, between, for the first year, low, average, and higher skilled children, which was based on teacher decision. But in year 2 for team handball, we used an objective handball test to determine the skill level of children. In the smash ball year, we did the same. So we also looked into differences between lower and higher skilled children. And we see in terms of participation that we are able to engage children of any skill level during those recess sessions.
Yeah, in the fitness study we did in first year, contrary to what we expected, we had no higher skilled children coming in. we only had lower and average skilled children coming in, which is great because that's actually why you do this. So, but it contradicted our expectations.
Could I make a comment on that? Who attends these extracurricular contexts? Because that was interesting with the mountain biking study too. I mentioned about there was more males than females, but these students that attended the mountain biking club, if you're familiar with the US system, that is middle school is where a lot of the competitive sports start. And so, and they're usually after school. Now at recess, it's very different, but you have competing activities after school. And many of the higher skill students did not come to the mountain biking club because they were doing volleyball or track or soccer or other sports that were organized by the school. So what we created was an interesting group of students that came regularly to the mountain biking club. They were not the traditional students who would tend to do the after school sports because they couldn't do it at that time. So, and it created quite an interesting group, similar to what I think Peter said, who seemed to develop a connection to mountain biking as something new that they could do. And they liked that environment of the after school club that was not naturally competitive. It was the student and the bike against the trail. And so it was kind of an interesting group that we developed in the after school participation. I just wanted to add that, Peter, because that was interesting for us too.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, Christy's gone with the competition piece. I've recently wrote this study up as part of a chapter in a book coming out in the UK on teaching lifetime sports in PE. And Christy's question there is about competition. And so now we're seeing a proliferation of some of these lifetime sports becoming competitive. I mean, if you're looking at the next Olympics, there's several of what we would say outdoor activities in the Olympics. And so there is an outlet for students in this town to compete for mountain biking. And I would suggest that the group that attended the after school club, it was not couched. It was only one or two of them that chose to go as they've moved through the program to more competitive outlets for mountain biking, which is competitive in this environment, in this space. There's definitely competitions for students to do mountain biking trails. We never put on competitions. We tried to move away from that with the way the after school club was set up. We'd have small groups, and then the students could select which trail they wanted to do depending on how confident they were on their biking skills. And so it was never set up as a race, so as to speak. One or two of the students have moved into competition, but the vast majority just come and ride. So it's an interesting question, particularly when you're looking at now competition within lifetime sports and how that's moved forward as a culture. We have 5 minutes. I did not want us to talk the whole time. I know we've talked most of the time. I'd like to, is there any interest in this phenomenon? I think we've got complementary frameworks here. Peter's and Kian's work is very data-based, labor-intensive. They're measuring the behaviors. What I'm trying to measure in looking at this phenomenon of transfer is really the cognitive steps that students go through in the decisions they make to enact those behaviors that Peter and Kian are actually measuring. And so we have somewhat different frameworks to look at this same idea, but hopefully complementary in terms of looking at mechanisms. And then Peter and Kian's work and the grad students do a great job of measuring the actual behaviors across those different contexts. Is there anybody who has an interest in this area or would like to bring forward their interest or particular ideas for networking? The whole idea of this Coffee Connect is that hopefully if you're interested in this topic, that you can connect with Peter, myself, or Kian. Is anybody kind of interested in this space?
I think it's a fascinating like area. If you think about like TPSR, they talk about transfer outside of the gym, but that's the least like actually researched aspect of TPSR. And if you look at different models, even like CISPAP, the one thing is like community engagement and stuff is very low research. So I think, I mean, I'm super interested in the out of school space because I think you have the time and the flexibility to do a lot more than you can with physical education. Like if you're only teaching a few 30-minute classes, how much can you get versus even what Peter, you all are doing in recess of having that structured time in there. And I think they're complementary. I think for a long time, physical education is like even trying to put after school PE, after school physical activity work into PE journals is sometimes hard because they're like, this is a physical education journal, but I think it's complementary. Like what is happening in recess and what is happening after school can reinforce what's happening in PE. And I think two of the studies that you just shared is an ideal framework for that.
Thanks, Risto. Good comment. Any other thoughts on this sort of phenomenon that we've been sort of addressing, or trying to address the last few years?
Can I jump in, Tristan?
Yeah.
I think it's really interesting how you can spark up this lifelong love to ride in the sense. So I am coaching a 90-year-old, getting him ready for the world record in terms of how many kilometers can you do in an hour in the velodrome, and there's so many more in that kind of older space that have it's come from what their experiences has been in middle school and in recess and how we've hooked them in along the way. So I think there's that kind of like transfer of how do we follow it on in almost like a longitudinal way to keep it going. So if we're suggesting it's all this for lifelong participation, are we actually at some point getting the lifelong double check to make sure that we're still going, and at what point do we drop off, and how can we get those hooks back again for getting everybody back in and remembering, let's go at the mountains, those kind of things. So I think it's all the presentations have been fabulous and really show how valuable what we do in PE and in physical activity and in recess and in after school make up that combination of that child and young person to inspire them to go forward. So thank you so much for this afternoon. It's been great.
Thanks, Christy. Just on one last point, Mark's point, and maybe this is an implication that neither Peter or I mentioned. How do the teachers emphasize transfer in their teaching of movement? How are they promoted? Whether they're offering the club at recess or whether they're offering the club after school, how are teachers being overt in the messaging about transfer? How are we trying to enable kids to think, okay, you've learned these skills in PE, where can you use them? What are those community resources, even if it's not offered within the school setting? And so this goes to Risto's point about building those connections. And I think if we're going to develop physically literate, which is what Christy, I think, was talking about then, we have to build those connections now while the students are experiencing that PE, such they develop the behavioral skills to say, I can do this and I will do this. And I think that's really important. I think the messaging of teachers, as Mark mentioned, how do we promote that transfer? Okay, Risto, I'm aware of time. I've got 10 o'clock here. I wrapped up. Just quick thanks to what you all for attending. Hopefully it was invigorating as you drank your coffee. And most thanks to Peter and Kian. And I've really enjoyed. I always like listening and collaborating with my Flemish friends. So, all right. Thanks,
Likewise.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye, everyone. Well done.